All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm here again with Eric. It's another episode of Understanding Platonism. And today we're going to be looking at the character of the sophist and the idea of sophistry generally and what that means today. But, you know, a lot of times we touch on these different topics related to Plato, and you realize as you go over this concept, whether it's the allegory of the cave or some other things we'll discuss, how much it influences modern thought and even language in ways you don't even notice. And you look at the sophists as one example, and calling someone a sophist, sophisticated. It is a thing we use in everyday language. The origin of the term is interesting though, because nowadays it is kind of used as an insult, like someone who is arguing in bad faith or is maybe kind of a grifter, and they're using philosophy or highfalutin ideas to promote themselves. We call them a sophist. But it seems like the terminology, the meaning of the term has changed a bit. Like sophist, Sophia, it's originally like lover of wisdom, right? So there doesn't seem to be like this sharp distinction between philosophers and sophists until Plato comes along. So what do you have to? Yeah, what's the story with the origin of this term?
Right. So the original Greek word is a noun, sophos, which just means wise. And that was applied by ancient historians like Herodotus to the sages of ancient Greece. So today we often think of Thales of Miletus as the first philosopher, but he would have just been called a sophist. The person who's actually credited with coining the term philosopher is Pythagoras. So philosopher does mean lover of wisdom, philo, Sophia. But sophos just meant a wise man generally. There were traditionally 7 sages of ancient Greece, people like Solon, Bias of Priene, and obviously others. And people don't always agree on this list, but it's these men were characterized by their capacity for aphoristic, wise sayings like "know thyself," sayings like "most men are bad," everything in moderation. These sorts of sayings. And there wasn't really a tight definition. There wasn't any one, ideology that they were all a part of. Pythagoras, is this next generation after this generation of the sages, and he really starts this particular philosophical approach that involves, not only dialectics but also mathematics and music and this whole kind of lifestyle. So in the Pythagorean tradition, philosophy became more of this kind of all embracing approach to life and attitude. Meanwhile, the designation sophos kind of expanded. So there's a Greek verb, sophistes, I think, which means like learning, becoming wise more so. And somehow or another, that was applied to a particular brand of itinerant teachers in the ancient world. This is a movement in the 5th century AD, like contemporary with the Athenian Empire, Athens under Pericles. Protagoras was the first to really take on this label of being a sophist, and he was the first to start charging people to teach them virtue. And that's really where Socrates in the dialogues takes issue with the sophists. Usually it is their claim that they can teach men to become virtuous. And basically, like, they were just teachers of various specialized things like rhetoric, or even like Hippias taught astronomy and math too. But there was this kind of blurry line between just general teachers, or like Prodicus was a teacher of grammar, general teachers, and then these kind of wise men who could overall make you into a more virtuous citizen. So a lot of the dialogues deal with criticizing the individual sophists and kind of where they're going wrong, and defining what sophistry is as opposed to philosophy. And we can get into some of that.
But you mentioned Pythagoras. So like you said, there wasn't this clean-cut distinction between sophists and philosophers, and it's Plato that gives us this and really sets it in motion. But you mentioned Pythagoras, but the term philosophy and philosopher came from Pythagoras.
That's the
So
traditional
it seems like, yeah, it seems like that's
attribution.
something
Yeah.
Plato has taken up from Pythagoras, right? So, yeah, so this idea of like pre-Socratic, post-Socratic philosophy, do you think maybe, is it fair to place Pythagoras as that person that's like that influential sort of turning point?
I think that is fair, just because Pythagoras starts institutions. Before Pythagoras, really, there's just Thales and Anaximander, who is a very interesting pre-Socratic philosopher. And I think it's fair to call these men philosophers, even though they didn't call themselves that, seemingly. There was Anaximenes, and then the next generation was really Heraclitus and Pythagoras. Pythagoras was the first to actually start schools that brought in this kind of integral approach, using mathematics, using music, using kind of a ritualistic, theurgic attitude. Philosophy was not a secular thing, and the way that Socrates approaches philosophy in the dialogues is certainly not a secular thing. The Sophists, on the other hand, could be quite secular, like Protagoras, who's often credited with starting what's called the first sophistic, this movement of these itinerant teachers in the 5th century BC. He was famously an agnostic. There was also, we should say, a second sophistic and a third sophistic. The second, in the 1st century AD, was kind of like adjacent to people like Plutarch. Lucian is one of the first, second sophistic thinkers, and that focused more on rhetoric. It was less kind of all-encompassing. And then there was a third sophistic as well in the 5th century AD. But yeah, that first sophistic had a lot of blurry lines, and so yeah, it was ambiguous whether Socrates even was a sophist or a philosopher. And even before Plato, many people did not like the sophists, and that's natural. This is a time of like Athenian prosperity, and many different thinkers from all around the Greek world would come to Athens to teach and try to basically influence prominent young men in Athens. So that's a situation that would naturally lead to animosity.
Well, let's get into it. I have some notes on the question of Socrates as a sophist, which is interesting. So the first one I think that really made this claim in kind of modern times is a guy called George Kerford in a book, The Sophistic Movement. And he argued that Socrates was part of that movement. There's a quote from him. He says, Socrates was quite widely regarded as part of the Sophistic movement, and the fact that he took no payment does not alter this function in any way. So again, when you get like kind of the introduction to the Sophists, this is like the basic distinction that we hear that Plato made is the difference between Socrates and the Sophists, even though, they had similar argument styles and methods, is that Socrates didn't accept payment and Sophists did. And, like I said, when we have the modern use of the word sophist, you have this sense of someone that's using rhetoric and philosophy for profit. But Kerford says that's not actually an important distinction. And he insists that actually the Sophists were quite serious thinkers. And I think a lot of people have suggested that, Plato maybe underplays how systematic the worldview of some of the Sophists were. And he says they played important roles in philosophy. They engaged in a wide range of scientific fields. He describes the Sophists as pioneer thinkers in sociology and some other fields. And so he sees no reason, basically, why Socrates should be excluded from this group. And also the problems and the problems discussed, methods used by Socrates are shared by the Sophists. So by treating Socrates and the Sophists as related, he eliminates opposition or contrast between them. And he suggests that the Sophists, including Socrates, were philosophers. So he's not saying that Socrates is a sophist in a negative sense, but he's kind of given their due to the Sophists. And he's saying there's no clear and hard distinction. So yeah, I mean, what do you think of that off the bat?
Right. I agree that the essential difference is not that the sophist accepts pay. Actually, Socrates did accept money. Like Critias was a big financial backer of Socrates, but he didn't ask for money. That's one difference. The real essential difference is that the philosopher is a lover of wisdom, an aspirant to wisdom, but doesn't claim to be wise. The sophist claims to have wisdom that they can then teach to others. In the dialogue, The Sophist, the Eleatic stranger, one of the definitions he comes up with for the sophist is essentially like a merchant of intellectual wares. And that's the way that sophists would treat the teachings that they had as a store of goods that they could distribute and give to others. That's completely antithetical to Socrates' method of teaching. The maieutic method, the kind of midwifery method, where you try to draw inspiration of ideas out of the other person, not that you already have the answers to give. Like someone like Hippias, the sophist Hippias, famously claimed to be able to answer all questions whatsoever. Gorgias, who is really more of a rhetorician than a sophist, but definitely falls under that same kind of first sophistic movement, Gorgias claimed to be able to answer all questions. So yeah, that is really the key difference. Socrates claims in the dialogues not to really have true knowledge. The Neoplatonic interpretation of that saying is that Socrates is comparing himself to the gods who have true knowledge. Now, compared to all of his contemporaries, Socrates' knowledge is exemplary, right, in many different fields, in analysis of Homer and the other poets, in geometry, in dialectics, especially. For the standards of
Well,
his time,
that's one of
Socrates
the
was.
that's one of the points this author Kerford makes, is that even though Socrates obviously declares ignorance, that the Athenians didn't necessarily take him at face value, right? Obviously, based on his trial and his execution, he seems to have been viewed as more provocative than a lot of the sophists he was cross-examining. But yeah, as far as the confession of ignorance, he argues that it was obviously considered by Athenians to be like an ironic mask for concealing his wisdom. Like it's kind of another sophistic paradox, right?
Well, I think it is partly that. Like in several occasions in the dialogues, Socrates will claim to have a bad memory. And often in those same dialogues, he demonstrates that he remembers very specifically what someone answered, several pages back in the text. So he will kind of assume and feign ignorance even when he's not ignorant. But I think there is a truth in that expression, which is, what a Neoplatonist like Hermias says it is. He is comparing human knowledge generally to the knowledge that divine beings have. And by that standard, he falls short like drastically. So I do think there is an earnest like humility there, and that carries forward with Plato and ultimately Carneades into academic skepticism. The first generations in the academy were more Pythagorean, and then after Carneades in like the 3rd century BC, the academy took a kind of skeptical turn, still building theories, still doing work, but just emphasizing basically this Socratic attitude that like we can't really be sure that we know these things. So I think that skepticism is really more akin to modern science, and that does set Socrates apart from the other sophists. Like interestingly, Protagoras, this kind of leading figure among the first sophistic, is credited by some as actually developing Socrates' method, the maieutic method. But at least as he's portrayed in the dialogues, Protagoras is very willing to give an answer even when he's not sure. They're willing to speculate. That's common to pretty much all of the sophists as portrayed in the dialogue. So I'm also curious, when these modern academics say that the Sophists had much more rigorous philosophical systems, like how are they making those inferences? Because we have a few works surviving from Gorgias on rhetoric, one work on like arguing for the non-existence of things. And so like the others, like Protagoras, I don't believe we have any surviving texts. So it's interesting when you compare like the views of these sophists to modern views, you glean a little bit of insight into what's motivating these modern academics to kind of valorize this first sophistic. Because Protagoras, his main uh, saying that he's attributed is man is the measure of all things. And this amounts to a kind of epistemological relativism, similar to Nietzschean perspectivism, similar to the postmodern kind of deconstruction of objective truth, and a figure like Callicles, or from the Gorgias, or Thrasymachus from the Republic. These are also sophists of that time. They have like proto-Nietzschean perspectives. They argue for might is right. So you do see like trends in the modern university system, postmodern deconstructive trends among that first sophistic.
Yeah, there's another book I looked at in preparing for this. It's called Sophistry and Political Philosophy, Protagoras' Challenge to Socrates. It's by a guy called Robert Bartlett. But he argues that our contemporary way of thinking, and he cites Nietzsche a lot on this, is basically Protagorean. He says Heraclitean,
Yeah.
Democritean, and Protagorean. And he says it's as Protagoras represented a synthesis of Heraclitus and Democritus in divining that reasons for morality are necessarily sophistical. Obviously, Heraclitus famously says one never steps into the same river twice, and Democritus poses that the first principles of the universe are atoms and empty space, atoms and the void. Everything else is merely thought to exist. So you have this combined vision of unstable materialism where speech loses reason. And the sophists emulate this pre-Socratic denial of perennial and intelligible reality in their instruction of the few to flatter the many. Although I think that might be a little unfair on Heraclitus. Right, he did have like the logos at the center of his system. But yeah, I mean, characterizing modern thought as Protagorean sounds fair. I mean, as far as the the Democritean or Democritian basis for modern thought, I'm actually writing something on this idea of bifurcation that Alfred North Whitehead talked a lot about, who was a Platonist, by the way. But yeah, it was kind of the reemergence of the heresy of materialism, of Democritian thought. Like there's the famous quote by Democritus where he says it's everything is atoms and the void, and he says that color, sensation, these kinds of things are matters of opinion, and he bifurcates the world into sensations, sort of primary and secondary qualities. And this obviously reemerges with Descartes and with Galileo, sparks the whole scientific revolution. And some sort of traditionalist authors like Wolfgang Smith have focused a lot on this as kind of the beginnings of the modern age, this bifurcation that led to a resurgence of Democritian atomism. But yeah, I mean, with the trends now, moving away from the scientific revolution and modernism into postmodernism, and these ideas that are very popular in the academy and things like postmodernism, that it's all about power, that truth is always a representation of power. The Nietzschean thought, it is a very Protagorean age, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that totally. Now, it's not though as simple as like the sophists are the bad guys in the dialogues, because Socrates says multiple times that he does send people to particular sophists for education, for that kind of preliminary education that they need. One of the most frequently cited sophists is Prodicus, and Socrates himself was a student of Prodicus. He paid to go take Prodicus's course on grammar, and Prodicus is
Yeah, I think
famous
I
for
don't
these
know.
fine.
I forget which one of the dialogues it is, but there is a young man that approaches Socrates asking to be a student, and he does recommend, like, he directly sends him to a sophist, right?
Yes, right. Um, so, like Hippias, for example, would be one of these sophists that did teach tangible, real skills that are important. He taught astronomy. He taught mathematics. He was an expert in the Homeric literature. Like these things have value, and Socrates recognized that. What he didn't appreciate was this kind of blurry line between I am a teacher of this in particular, and this is the knowledge I have to give you, versus I am a teacher of virtue generally, and I can simply make you a better person. That's the way Socrates approaches Gorgias at the beginning of the Gorgias. That's the way he approaches Protagoras at the beginning of the dialogue, the Protagoras, basically asking, like, what is it that the students who go to you are getting? Like, what is it that you teach specifically? What is that skill? And how can you be sure that that's actually passed on? This question of whether virtue is capable of being taught is a big theme throughout much of the Platonic literature. In some sense, it seems like the answer is affirmative because Socrates seems to imply that all of the virtues, like temperance and courage and obviously wisdom, are forms of knowledge, and justice is a form of knowledge in some sense. Courage he defines as essentially like knowing correctly what one really ought to fear. So the problem with cowards on the battlefield is that they immediately sense this danger to their body, but they're not bearing in mind that it's much more important to worry about their kind of broader reputation, and also like the purity of their soul and the fate of their soul. So if you really know what's good for you, then like you'll have no choice basically but to do what's right, and be courageous and stick to that. So he treats all of the virtues as like modifications of knowledge in some sense, but then in other places, like in the Republic, he says that wisdom, for example, is simply innate and inborn, and there's really not much that can be done to increase a person's wisdom, to make them wiser. What the teacher does then is not to like give the student knowledge of virtue, which may be impossible, but rather it's to like instigate an inner dialogue within the student, allow them to internalize that dialectical process and begin asking themselves these questions, and investigating the relation of the different parts of their soul, investigating their true self. Like this is kind of the heart of the Socratic approach, getting the student to investigate for themselves using their like given faculties that they have. In the Scala Virtutum, the ladder of virtues that the Neoplatonists talk about, and I imagine we'll talk about that at greater length in a future episode, but they distinguish, natural virtues as like the foundation of all virtue from habituated virtues. But it does seem that those natural virtues are very important, and Plato had no illusions that humanity is a blank slate. People are dealt different cards, and he even explains that in terms of the process of metempsychosis, going into the afterworld, underworld, and like choosing your next life and what kind of soul you're going to inhabit. So we're not all kind of created equal, and nevertheless, though, we can kind of make progress in one lifetime. Plutarch, the Middle Platonist, emphasizes how important education is. However, I would consider Plutarch fairly true to the spirit that Plato exemplifies in dialogues. And I think Plato also, obviously the founder of like the first institute of higher education in the West, did believe education was efficacious in some sense, but it's I think in that Pythagorean vein, it needs to be a lifestyle. It needs to be an embodied attitude towards the world and towards wisdom. And it can't be this simple, like, distribution of intellectual wares, and I think you do see that online as well, this kind of like online grifter, rhetorician, sophist archetype, where they have all the answers about the red pill. They have the secret truth, and you just have to subscribe for $10 a month and they can give it to you. So, yeah.
Yeah, by the way, you can get these on Substack, these podcasts on Substack now, and you should subscribe to me there for $5 a month on the paid subscriptions. And we'll give you all the answers. But yeah, no, it actually is interesting, because you said like the way modern academics like kind of celebrate the sophists. I did encounter this a lot when I was doing some research for this, where you you have these leftist academics, and it's like, oh, actually, Plato is this bad guy of history, and these sophists were actually, they had it all figured out, and they were repressed, had these great ideas. But it is interesting. A lot of like modern political thought was there in some of these sophists. Some of it we don't know about directly. It's mentioned indirectly by Platonists, but there's a sophist, Lycophron, who I'm not sure. I don't think we have any writing by him directly, but we know that he attacked Aristotle's politics, and he basically advocated for like a night watchman state. Thought that the only authority for the state was to protect the life and liberty of its citizens, and he did make this argument on kind of like Hobbesian grounds, like with this kind of relativism. The purpose of the state can't be virtue or the good, and this kind of fear of death, sort of social contract theory. That seems to be, that was at least a current of thought. So it is. I mean, it is interesting sometimes when we look at like the progress of philosophy, and it seems like this stuff we embraced in the past few centuries was quite new, and it was overturning this stuff that was taken for granted in antiquity. But it really was all there. You mentioned Callicles. Like he really is like sort of a Nietzschean figure. I don't think Nietzsche ever actually references him, which is kind of odd, because he does make the Nietzschean argument, right? And he draws this physis nomos delineation, which is like this distinction between like law and nature. Or I mean, nomos seems like a kind of a difficult word to translate exactly. But yeah, he like draws this out to the extreme,
Mm-hmm.
and he sees nomos as just this sort of sly, sort of authoritarian construct to enslave man, and he has this
Slave
sort of might
morality,
is
right?
right. Yeah, exactly. He has this, might is right. The weak should fear the strong should rule the weak. And nomos is yeah, this sort of slave morality way around that, devised by the weak. So it is all there, right? So it is interesting to look back from that perspective now that you read it, and these characters, I mean, they ultimately won, right? Their ideas are what is common and is popular and is kind of taken for granted now. So what's like the most influential arguments that Socrates lands against the sophists? Because obviously, like, these are sort of perennial arguments, and it's a perennial debate, right, between relativism and the Platonist perspective. So what's like the sort of
Right.
killing blows that Socrates lands in the dialogues?
Well, against that argument from Callicles, Socrates' response is basically that there isn't a real distinction between what is approved by convention and what is like right by nature, if the right by nature is that the strong should rule, because the conventional opinion is the opinion of the majority. The majority is stronger in some sense than the minority. Therefore, it's not just by convention, but by nature. So often, like, these things collapse because the position carries a kind of internal contradiction. So, with regard to like Protagoras's position, of relativism, we have the argument that Socrates recites in the Theaetetus. The dialogue takes place after Protagoras has died, and Socrates takes the figure of Protagoras in another context to illustrate Theaetetus's initial guess at the nature of knowledge. But in any case, he has to kind of rehearse Protagoras' general thesis of relativism, man being the measure of all things. And the obvious problem with that is that, well, he puts it kind of in a quip that, like, why didn't Protagoras say that pigs are the measure of all things, or dogs, or, whatever? Because if there is no real distinction between a wise man who perceives the truth and a unwise, foolish man who perceives falsely, then, there's no grounds to say in that case, even that Protagoras' own view that relativism is the case is a true view. He puts in the mouth of Protagoras
So
that's kind of
the classic argument a lot of people will be familiar with, that relativism is self-refuting, because if you assert relativism, you can't assert anything to be true, so you can't assert that relativism is true, right?
Exactly. It's self-contradictory. That's the problem you run into. Protagoras responds,
I
though,
thought
that there is a real difference.
You can correct me, but I thought in the Protagoras, when he brings up comparing man to beast. I thought the purpose of that was kind of to refute this Heraclitean, it's all flux, that like animals clearly recognize the same objects and entities we do. So there's not that extreme subjectivism in that case.
Right. The argument I'm talking about is from the Theaetetus, where Socrates assumes the voice of Protagoras. And Socrates assumes the voice of Protagoras also to kind of reply that there is a difference between the wise and the unwise, and the wise man is the one who turns his attention towards good things. Now, here's where it gets into an even kind of deeper subtlety. At the end of the Protagoras says that he respects Socrates the most among all his contemporaries. And despite the irritation with Socrates, that was a common view, because the Delphic oracle proclaimed Socrates to be the wisest of all living men at the time. So somebody asked, who's the wisest man living? And the oracle answered Socrates. So Protagoras, even being agnostic and not a believer in the gods, nevertheless has this reverence for Socrates. And also, Protagoras's kind of deeper doctrines that we don't see in the Protagoras, but we do see in the Theaetetus, rehearsed by Socrates, are part of the Pythagorean system at some level. It just isn't the full system. So he reduces reality to two fundamental kinds of motion: a more active motion and a more passive motion. And this is very similar, if you read the details of it from the Theaetetus, to the monad and the indefinite dyad, the principle of the masculine, the limiting principle, and then the principle of the feminine, the unlimited and receptive principle that kind of leads to expansion. So there are some other kind of symmetries between Protagoras' position and the Platonic position, like man being the measure of all things, and the notion that we turn our attention towards that which is good. In Neoplatonism, the position on the problem of evil ends up being a kind of privatio boni, right? There is no arche, or principle of evil. Evil has no subsistence in itself. It's only our lack of view of the whole that allows us to believe that there is this evil. So when Protagoras says that we just have to turn our attention towards that which is good, but however there isn't any real falsehood, there is an element of truth to that, because there isn't substantial evil, there isn't substantial falsehood. there's only like different grades of reality in the Platonic view, stemming from the more integrated, united, holy in the forms, down to the more kind of murky and shadowy existences down here in the world of generation. And by turning our attention towards the really real, we do become wise. And it is the case that even when you're perceiving that darkest, most shadowy reality, everything that you perceive, that you actually do sense and perceive, is formal, is real, is true. So in a sense, there is no false opinion, as Protagoras argues, because man is the measure of all things, but also because it's impossible to say that which is not. Socrates, or rather the Eleatic stranger, attacks this problem in the Sophist pretty much head on. And that's a big digression, to be complex to get into. But basically, this is another like talking point that Socrates may have gotten from Protagoras, that, it's impossible to believe falsely, because what is it that you're believing in? A thought has to be about something. So if the thing isn't there, if it's non-existent, then how is the false belief possible? This is how Protagoras gets rid of this, like the existence of untruth. His famous work, which is lost, is called On Truth. So at some level, Protagoras was quite close to the kind of Pythagorean Platonic view. Like on multiple points, there are these symmetries. However, he doesn't have the whole picture. And that's also something we would expect given the Platonic ontology. There is the singular, one, united, real arche, the really real being. And then there are its emanations, where some emanations are greater likenesses of the original, and then some are kind of murkier and fade away. So among the Sophists, you could say that like Pythagoras is the true philosopher, and then Protagoras is like, even the name kind of ironically is the most similar. Protagoras is the first image and closest likeness. And then maybe someone like Hippias follows, who is studying mathematics, but like claims to know too much already and doesn't have that appropriate kind of humility and philosophical attitude. And, that descends, through Prodicus, through Gorgias, all the way down to figures like Callicles and Thrasymachus, who end up affirming pleasure, who end up affirming that there is only the world of generation, there are no forms of things. So yeah, I wanted to relate that to the system of analogies between various occupations that are given in the Gorgias. So in the Gorgias, Socrates is asked by Paulus, another sophist of that time, who has kind of an intermediate position between Gorgias and Callicles, not as like Nietzschean as Callicles seems to be, but a little bit more relativistic than Gorgias. Gorgias kind of has the same attitude that Hippias does. He's good at coming up with arguments for things, and he assumes this like very knowledgeable position, whereas Prodicus would be more willing to kind of admit like a certain form of relativity. But Gorgias is portrayed pretty favorably in the Gorgias, compared to Prodicus and Callicles. But in any case, Prodicus asks Socrates what he takes rhetoric to be. So this is adjacent to sophistry. The rhetorician and the sophist are different figures, but even in the Gorgias, Socrates says that it's common to mix up what the occupation of the sophist is with the occupation of the rhetorician, because they are, so kind of intimately related. But in explaining what the sophist actually is, he has to draw an analogy to what it is in the image of. So basically, he gives 4 true occupations, and then 4 similitudes of occupations, 4 sciences, and then 4 kind of similitudes of sciences. So the highest of these sciences is legislation. And of course, in the Platonic worldview, the true legislator is the true philosopher. The true statesman is the true philosopher. So that is the highest true science, and its direct imitation is sophistry, where you come up with arguments, you come up with philosophical arguments, philosophemes that are incomplete, that aren't, integrally unified into one comprehensive system that all works. That's why you can point to contradictions in their views. And then beneath the legislator, we have the judge as the true kind of administrator of the legal system, and they would have to practice true judgment, and that would involve this kind of ability to also persuade about the true value of things. So that's also sort of the true rhetoric. But its imitation is the false rhetoric, which is the one that we're more familiar with, where you can make any side of a debate seem very compelling. That's the way that many of these rhetoricians from the first, second, and third sophistics treated rhetoric. It's the ability to make your case very powerfully. The rhetors in ancient Athens were the lawyers. That was like the main way that they were employed. So that's also why when Gorgias is asked initially about what his subject or his occupation concerns, he doesn't say it's just the ability to persuade about anything. He says it's the ability to persuade about the just and the unjust in courts of law, because the rhetors were basically lawyers, and Gorgias was out there teaching people how to be really effective lawyers. So the other occupations, the top two that we just went through, the legislator and the judge in the real column, and then the sophist and the rhetorician in the kind of simulation column, those have to do with the soul. The next two real occupations are the gymnastics teacher, kind of physical trainer, basically, and then on the bottom is the doctor. And these are analogous to the higher two occupations that deal with the soul. So the trainer of gymnastics is equivalent to the legislator in that he gives the kind of law that ought to administer the body, and that requires science, that requires like knowledge of what is truly good for the body. And that is also a criteria that Socrates gives in the Gorgias for a true science. It has to know why what it's doing is good and what is bad. It's not enough just to be able to produce some given result if you want to. Like, that takes knowledge, but it's not true scientific knowledge unless it gives you true power. And to have true power, you have to know that what you're doing is actually good, because we all seek the good. That's a very kind of adumbrated version of one of the arguments from the Gorgias. But yeah, so the doctor then is like the equivalent of the judge. They administer and maintain the body in the way that the judge administers and maintains this legal system that the true philosopher comes up with in the domain of the soul. Now, the simulations of those for the gymnastics teacher is the cosmetician, or the person, who is an expert in clothing and makeup and things like that, and makes the person appear to be well regulated and healthy, but they're not actually necessarily. And then on the bottom, corresponding to the doctor, is the cook. So the true doctor knows what foods people need as medicine. Food and medicine aren't fundamentally distinct, I think, in Plato's opinion. And the cook, it just satisfies people's tastes and gives them pleasant experiences, and that seems like a similar thing to what medicine does, but not quite. So yeah, those are the 8 occupations, and that kind of gives us some analogical reference points to consider what the sophist is, what the rhetorician is, how they're distinct. And naturally, because these similitudes are less real than the true sciences that they're imitations of, and because the soul is harder for us to discern than bodily things, the rhetorician and the sophist often get confused, and their spheres intermingle.
Yeah, so you touched on some of that covers a lot of the kind of arguments around epistemology and relativism that Socrates makes. How does he argue for the Platonic conception of the good? Like, from the perspective of, like, in some of these dialogues, it's not like he's outlining the full Platonic ontology, right? So how is he taking the typical sophist from their more kind of common sense perspective on the virtues or self-interested perspective, how does he take them to this very like mystical, soul-focused ethic?
Right. Well, he uses sophistical tactics in many cases, like in the Gorgias, the way that he tries to persuade Polus that it is better to be punished if you do wrong involves um, possibly some equivocation of terms. I certainly wasn't convinced by the reasoning, like on its own intrinsic merits that Socrates gives. Um, but yeah, so he also argues that all people pursue their, proper good a lot more persuasively, saying there's a difference between doing what you want, and then doing what you will. So everyone wills what is good for them, and the way he phrases it, I mean, it makes it seem like just a basic tautology. Of course, everyone wants a good condition and not a bad condition. That's kind of just what being good is. It's like the preferable state. It's kind of built into what the good seems to be. But he makes it clear through a fairly simple and I think valid argument that what you want to do is not necessarily the same as what you would want to do if you had, perfect knowledge of how to get to your proper end. So yeah, the argument with regard to punishment is, I think I can recall it well enough, or at least like summarize it briefly. It's basically that the agent and the patient correspond in actions. So if I hit something hard, the thing that I hit is hit hard. So the affection of the patient answers to the affection of the agent. And so it is just to punish someone who has done a wrong deed. And then he, through like a series of equivocations and like symmetrical definitions, basically an argument in the form of A is B, B is C, C is D, so D is A, ends up saying that like a just thing is a good thing. So when you say that, when Socrates says that someone who is punished justly suffers justly, based on this idea that the affection of the agent and the affection of the patient are symmetrical necessarily. If you're, if you are punished justly, then and to be just is to be good, then you suffer what is good, and you are benefited by being punished. So that is, I think, if you look at that argument from the Gorgias, you'll see there are some very dubious tactics being used. And that's not the only instance where Socrates does that. Socrates does descend to sophistical tactics very often, especially when he's dealing with sophists to make his points. But he won't do it when he's dealing with like a true seeker of wisdom. Like he doesn't use sophistical tactics on someone like Theaetetus, this young kid who's like skilled in mathematics and is just getting into philosophical thought. When he's dealing with someone who actually wants to pursue like what's true, like in the Republic, talking to Glaucon or someone, he will kind of go to great lengths and consider at leisure. But when he's pressed on the spot, dealing with someone like Polus or Callicles, he's perfectly comfortable using these sorts of sophistical tactics. He uses a similar tactic on Callicles, where he forces Callicles to admit that pleasure is different from the good. And there are a few, we don't have to go into the specific arguments. I definitely recommend the Gorgias very highly among all of the dialogues. It's a good kind of beginner dialogue. But he forces Callicles to admit that the pleasant is not the same as the good. Now, in the Protagoras, Socrates argues exactly the opposite, that actually the good and the pleasant perfectly coincide. And some pleasures are not good merely because they don't amount to pleasure in the long run. So he makes an argument basically that, we have to have low time preference. And he says that people mistake what is actually good for them because things that are immediately at hand seem larger. And so we weigh the pleasures that we might experience higher when they're accessible to us. And so we end up choosing what is actually leading to the less pleasant experience overall. So he has this relatively sophisticated perspective on the good that treats pleasure as synonymous with good at one level, but then argues exactly the opposite for Callicles to make his point. And that ties into Socrates' conception of, the Platonic Socrates, at least. We don't really know how much is genuine to Socrates, but Socrates' conception in the Phaedrus of the true rhetoric. And the true rhetoric is not just like a set of tactics that are used to persuade the multitude, which is the kind of sophistic conception of what rhetoric is. It's like a toolkit of techniques to effectively persuade the masses, the ignorant. But the true Socratic rhetoric is based on understanding the type of soul that you're dealing with. So in the Phaedrus, we get this explanation of how it comes to be that there are various different kind of grades of soul. The highest three types of soul are the philosophical, of course, the musical, and the soul of the lover, presumably like the true Platonic lover, not like a licentious person. And then, beneath that, there's things like the politician, the moneymaker, etc. I think there are 9 in total, and I don't have the list memorized, but part of the true rhetoric is identifying where a person falls in this scheme, kind of archetypally profiling their personality, and then responding accordingly. And Socrates shows a great sensitivity to like where a person is coming from, and argues not necessarily just in a straight line towards the truest perspective that he identifies on a matter, but instead he looks at where a person is starting from and just kind of gently, moves them a little bit closer to the truth. So yeah, but however, that is a kind of sophistical tactic that he employs in many cases. In his commentary on the Gorgias Olympiodorus, characterizes the beneficial kind of sophist as one who refutes wrong opinion. And that's the kind of sophistry that Socrates adopts. He adopts sophistical tactics in order to cure people of the twofold ignorance, which is to not know when you believe that you know. And that's the worst condition to be in, because then you're unlikely to change your mind and pursue wisdom because you think you already have the truth. So that, interestingly, also Damascius comments on this. This kind of true function of the sophist is reflected in the order of souls above mortal souls, the daimonical order, and the materially invested daimons, who are themselves kind of descended and attracted to matter, and hover about the world, kind of causing trouble for our souls. These forces serve a kind of sophistical role. So they administer punishments for our vices, although they themselves are like motivated badly. Nevertheless, they provide a kind of providential, beneficial function. And so sophists, although their intentions may not be the purest, and they are descended and they are imperfect images and they don't have true science, nevertheless, their being there somehow makes the world greater.
All right, now you mentioned this a little bit already. I don't even have a question on this, but I do think it's worth it's worth noting. I mean, we said like it's kind of a sophistical age or a Protagorean age in the sort of background metaphysical assumptions, right, or lack of metaphysical assumptions. But also even in the last few years, with like the rise of like the Tate style content and like short form video, there is this huge explosion in sophistry, basically, because this lifestyle stuff has gotten so popular with men that comprise the majority of like the YouTube audience, and now it's moved to these other platforms. But yeah, it's become very popular to sell to sell lifestyle audience. Lifestyle solutions, and basically sell like an all-encompassing worldview to people, whether it's vitalism or Nietzscheanism or whatever. And you see, like, there's certain thinkers that are the, the thinkers that are popular in the algorithm, right? Like they get clicks. Nietzsche, Ayn Rand, these different people that kind of crop up again and again. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think we're gonna see a lot more of it because there's clearly an appetite there, like with the how popular Jordan Peterson got, and you often observe like these manosphere guys like Tate, they kind of burn themselves out with some of it, and then they eventually move on to religion or some kind of greater philosophy that they can uh, sell as a more total package. So it really is like an age of sophistry, right? I mean, everyone is into kind of very piecemeal, easy kind of worldviews they can adopt. That basically, I mean, it seems like in most cases, what the worldviews they adopt do is kind of justify their own hedonism or individualism, but kind of valorize it somewhat. Like, you're not just a hedonist trying to get rich; you're actually fighting the matrix by getting rich. This kind of stuff. Um, but yeah, I mean, you see this all over the place. Even like popular philosophy channels, you see things like the School of Life, and they have this approach to teaching philosophy, which is really harmful. Where it's like every thinker was actually just like a kind of atheist relativist. Like, you can kind of ignore all the God stuff or the morality stuff. That's kind of secondary. Like, what Plato was really talking about was finding true love and soulmates. Or I remember they had a video on Hegel where it was like Hegel was just teaching us that we have to learn from our mistakes. That's what the dialectic is really about, this kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing when you have like algorithms and the attention economy, what they're calling it now, and it's what people click, what people watch is rewarded. Obviously, everything gets dragged down to a certain level. And then, yeah, and how philosophy is approached now, in the main, it really is self-help, right? Self-help and just kind of post hoc justification for like ongoing hedonism, individualism. So I think it's definitely fair to characterize it as an age of sophistry, and that seems to be really accelerating with the internet. I guess we'll only see more of it.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. Of course, there is that spectrum of types of sophistry, being an image of the true singular kind of archetype of the true philosophy. Sophistry comes in many different forms. Some are more beneficial than others. So when people get interested in arguments for the sake of argument, that may lead them to then have the skill to recognize, the true philosophy when they encounter it, or if it leads someone to recognize the need for a total coherent system, because when you've gotten in a bunch of debates online, you notice that all these various aspects of a worldview necessarily tie together, so that leads you to seek this kind of integral unity. And if it leads people to religion, generally that's probably a fairly positive thing. But like, yes, Plato's attitude towards the relative power of sophists and philosophers seems to be very pessimistic, because the sophist generally and the rhetorician generally will pay attention to the attitudes of the multitude. They'll find the talking points that are saleable and steer clear of the hard truths that are counterintuitive, and yeah, that the masses won't find palatable. So that leads to them being affirmed by the masses. The many are bad, right? Bias of Priene. And Plato agrees with that, saying, evil is in the direction, there is no like true evil in itself, but it's in the direction of kind of pure multiplicity. And the good is in the direction of pure unity. So you have a bunch of sophists having different opinions, and then you have like one or two true philosophers who all through the ages agree with each other. That's why you still have people who are pretty, true believing Platonists even today. And yeah, there's a superficial similarity between Protagoras' view and modern relativism, and there are these things that keep occurring, but they're not occurring in like an explicitly Protagorean form, where often many of the greatest intellectuals today call themselves explicitly Platonists. So yeah, that's kind of related to this idea of like there is no arche of evil. So like there aren't, for example, like archetypes of monstrosities or like mutations off of the true forms, and yet similar mutations, similar deviations do occur, not because they share an archetype, but because the pathways of corruption are only so many. So there are these kind of perennial tendencies within sophistry, but it'll always assume some new form. It's Protagorean. It is, or rather, I meant to say, oh shoot, starts with a P. The god in the Odyssey that changes shapes. Got to check our Greek myth knowledge here. Well, I suppose it's not that important. Somebody look it up, answer in the chat. But yeah, it changes forms, and that can be a good thing though, insofar as the sophist does perform
Like
a kind of
Proteus.
providential. Yes, Proteus. Okay,
I had
thank
to
you.
Google it.
Yeah, I'm glad we got that. So yeah, there's no pinning them down. They will adapt, and they're going to find new ways of appealing to the multitude. So for me, I think that, yeah, there will be a proliferation of sophistry, but I think what Plato did in his lifetime, starting a serious institution, writing the like most artistically polished and comprehensive philosophical works of all history, like putting something out there like that dwarfs the achievements of something like Protagoras' On Truth, that's what you have to respond with. The few and the good have to respond to the many and the corrupt by just creating more goodness. You're not going to do that by persuading the multitude to turn towards that. Instead, the few and the good just need to go forward and make what is good in their image. So that's the real problem for me. The real worry is not that the people incline more towards sophistry, but the emerging AIs are become the greatest sophists and rhetoricians, and they have no true spirit of philosophy because they have no conception of value. To be a philosopher, you have to genuinely seek wisdom, and wisdom is a sort of knowledge of what is truly good. So you have to know true goodness. And that's really hard to put in an algorithm. So I think AI will lead to a proliferation of sophistical tactics. We won't even need like human sophists anymore. The algorithm will simply know what to feed you to keep your attention. It will know the kind of many-headed beast of appetite better than any human sophist. So, I mean, I don't really see a remedy to that other than somehow thinking about how an AI philosopher could be developed. That's kind of John Vervaeke's project in cognitive science, is like really operationalizing notions like wisdom so that we can get closer to avoiding that kind of future of sophistical AI and hopefully get towards a philosophical AI. Whether that's possible or not, I'm not willing to judge on. I'd imagine you would think it's not possible to have an AI philosopher.
I wouldn't have thought so, no. But you have presented a very dystopian picture. Just imagining like TikTok full of millions of videos of like AI spliced up philosophy that's like the perfectly awful blend of like vitalism and popular Nietzsche and pop science and like theism and stuff. That's and like perfectly curated to catch your attention span as well, based on AI machine learning. It's a terrifying future.
Right. I don't want to end on this note. I would say I do have hope. I do have hope for the AI philosopher, but in order to build it, we have to really examine, the nature of wisdom for ourselves. And I really don't see a better way of getting at that than going through the dialogues and taking the Platonic approach, because the good is the one and it remains the same and it's not changeable. So we already have that good. It's just a matter of turning our attention towards it. And so that's, I guess, I'll keep focusing my attention on. And the dystopia may come, but Plato expected that dystopias will come. They'll rise and fall. That's part of the world of generation. And the true sage, it doesn't hang his hat on that ephemeral, changeable reality. They turn towards what is really real, what is eternal. So we can only hope to do the same.
All right, well, Eric, I've enjoyed this. As always, we will be back again with more. And also, by the way, if you're listening to this, Eric does have a channel on YouTube. It's just Understanding Plato is the title of it, right?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever actually promoted on this, but yeah, you should obviously check that out. You'll get a lot more content on this kind of thing there. Give him a subscribe. And yeah, thanks again for showing up, Eric. We'll be back again.
Thank you, Keith. It was fun.